and more recently, data analytics. So he has published dozens of articles on these topics in top leading international journals, such as Descriptive Studies, Cognitive Linguistics, and Journal Pragmatics. And his most recent publication monograph is Time Series Analysis of Discourse, Methods and Case Studies by Routledge. And he's also on the editorial board of Metaphor and Symbol, Metaphor and Social World, PLOS ONE, and Cognitive Linguistics Studies. So today, he's going to share with us his recent study on classroom language during COVID-19. Okay, so modeling classroom language pre and during COVID-19 for critical reflection. So let's welcome Dr. Dennis Tay.
Right, thank you very much, William. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending my talk. I hope you can see the slides and also hear my voice.
Yes.
So today, I just want to share a kind of like a nice little study that I have been dabbling with recently, just to explore the ways in which my own personal language use in the classroom has or has not been influenced by the recent shift towards online teaching as a result of COVID-19. So through this talk, I also hope to introduce a kind of general modeling approach, which can hopefully be replicated if you're interested in your own reflections and research, and how it kind of like complements more traditional discourse analytic ways of looking at classroom language. Right, so I will start with a very quick background. Of course, COVID-19 and the predicament that we all find ourselves in need no extensive introduction. You know, we know that there's a new normal going on. There's a global shift towards online TNL, which stands for teaching and learning. But then something that we might overlook in our general pessimism and despair is that these also bring about opportunities for research and some reflection, especially for people who are teachers. Right, so I just want to introduce to and this will be like a springboard to talk about a general four-step quantitative modeling approach that has been followed in many related studies, but I'm going to apply it to kind of like try to compare both between as well as within face-to-face, which is pre-COVID, and online, which is during COVID, classroom language. I'll give some examples and also share what are some of the insights that I have personally gleaned for myself. And if there is time, I will go a bit further by talking also about how slightly less conventional time-based models can be applied. So of course, classroom language is time-based because it happens across the semester week by week. Okay, so this global shift towards online TNL, again, like I said, needs no extensive introduction. We know that there has been a severe impact of the coronavirus on global higher education. And as you can see in both newspapers, as well as research articles, there has been some suggestion that COVID-19 will not last forever, but online teaching is like the new normal. And also, online teaching could permanently change, or rather COVID-19 could permanently change how education is delivered. So it's a very timely and significant topic to look at, the effects of online TNL. Right, so we know that there has been a lot of work actually to examine the impact of online TNL, but a lot of it has rightfully been focused on things like policy, attitudes towards it, and also the use of digital technologies, right? The very fact that we are talking over Zoom is a live example of that. So, however, we know that teaching and learning is more or less constituted by the use of language. So, quite surprisingly, there hasn't been too much work on how language itself has been shaped by, or maybe more optimistically, adapted to this transition, right? So this is a significant question, a very general question, but at two specific levels, it's significant. Firstly, for research. So needless to say, there's already a lot of interest in classroom language or discourse in general. So if I can discern two very broad approaches, for instance, the work of Douglas Biber looking at corpus-based, variationist approaches, how classroom language varies according to register, according to the levels of academic levels and stuff like that. And then there's also more ethnographic approaches to describe, for instance, how learning is constructed in the classroom, right? So both these approaches have yielded a lot of studies, which I don't have to extensively review, right? And then on the other hand, however, something that is even more overlooked is that how this situation gives us opportunities to reflect on our own use of language, right? And this is useful for both personal and as well as professional purposes. For instance, in some cases, we find ourselves having to document how we have improved despite, or how we have coped with these circumstances, for instance, in the context of a teaching portfolio, then it might be interesting for us to take a step back and look at our own language and to model it and to analyze and understand the differences for our own edification. So today my talk is focusing more on reflection about ourselves. Right, so I'm just going to talk about a very general quantitative modeling approach and how I've applied to this approach to my own language. So this talk is also slightly aimed towards perhaps like students, right, to kind of like just to impart some of the general techniques. I know some of us in the audience are experts in this area, so I will really cherish your feedback and criticism as well. So I think quantitative modeling is describable in terms of it has three traits that make me kind of like appreciate its value for this kind of work. First of all, it's flexible. Second of all, it's transparent, and lastly, it's replicable. And I think all three traits are kind of important if we want to approach these kinds of questions systematically. Right, flexible because there are a lot of ways to consider your data set as kind of like an ecology of different variables, and how we can kind of like craft and explore and write a narrative about the data based on the way you approach the data set. Right, it's transparent because the data sets and the methodologies are essentially reproducible. Right, they can be scrutinized, they're reproducible, and therefore in that sense they are transparent, and of course replicable. So you can take this approach and do it on your own data if you so wish. Right, so the data set I'm going to talk about today are actually lecture transcripts from my own undergraduate elective course, ENGL 4022. So I basically have two comparable, so-called corpora. So the first one is a face-to-face corpus that is obtained before COVID in 2019 and 20. Of course, I didn't obtain it because I didn't foresee that I will use it in this way. Right, it was obtained for another project, but it came in handy for this specific study. And an online so-called corpus is during COVID, which is the previous year. Right, so I have recordings of 2 years worth of, or rather 2 semesters worth of this course. Right, so I looked at the first 10 lectures, right, or rather the 10 contents lectures that I have in this course. Right, each one is divided into 3 hourly segments to reflect the fact that after every hour I give students a break. So I have essentially 30 segments of classroom transcripts per semester. And one of the limitations is that I didn't do any video recording, so there's no analysis of things like gestures and stuff like that. Only audio, and in this talk I only model my language. Right, so you might consider that a limitation if you are also interested in kind of like co-construction of knowledge. Right, and then what I did was to apply certain quantitative modeling steps that I will talk about in more detail. So the first step, to quantify language, right, I use LLWC, which if you are interested in socio-psychological research, you might be familiar with already, the summary variables of LLWC. And then with the outcomes of this quantification, I then applied some modeling techniques implemented in Python. So to use some machine learning jargon, right, there are both supervised and unsupervised techniques involved. So for supervised, I call it supervised, it's because you kind of like specify what are the variables beforehand. And I applied linear mixed models to consider how the variable scores, vary according to the mode of delivery, and as well as within taking into account the kind of like clustering within each lecture. Right, and then unsupervised, I kind of like introduce the idea of AHC, so agglomerative hierarchical clustering. So this is basically a technique to kind of like group objects into natural groups based on their properties. Right, so these two kind of like general methodologies allow us to gain some insights into how the language differs between these two. Right, I'll provide some examples in context, and if there is time, I'll go a bit further to talk about other less conventional time-based models, ARIMA, time series analysis, and the survival analysis, which I'm recently dabbling with. Right, so this is LLWC. It's basically a text analytics software that has a very simple idea. It's like a bag of words software where it simply counts the number of times that a certain word in a certain category appears, and it expresses it as a proportion of the total data set. So this software is very useful and popular in language and social psychological research. And another important and subtle reason why I used it for this specific talk is because it kind of measures how something is said rather than what is being said. So since I'm not so interested in modeling the contents of my class, because I already know what the contents are about, I'm more interested in like the attitudinal stances, like socio-psychological aspects of the language. And therefore, this is quite an interesting choice. Of course, this choice is paradigmatic. You know, there are tons of other kinds of programs that you can use to kind of like quantify the various aspects of language use. So what we have in LAWC is that, as you can see over here, it actually can measure two types of variables. So each row is basically a session transcript, right? You can see here it can model linguistic variables, which are just frequency counts. For instance, in this case, pronouns, which is subdivided into personal pronouns, first person singular, first person plural, second person, third person singular, third person plural, and impersonal pronouns. There are a lot of other linguistic categories as well. So all these numbers are actually percentages. So for instance, in the first file, in the first lecture, 19% of all words are pronouns, and so on and so forth, right? This is interesting, but for today, I want to focus on this set of variables, which are called summary variables. So these are not just frequency counts, they are kind of like formulaic because they are kind of like linear combinations of these different linguistic variables. And these four variables, analytic, cloud, authentic, tone, tell us something about how language is used rather than what is used. So LAWC works on the basis of counting conventional rather than so-called creative words, or you can say grammatical rather than lexical words. So you can see from this table, the idea is that previous studies have shown, all these studies have shown that certain configurations of conventional words can actually reliably index certain socio-psychological stances. So for instance, a lot of studies have shown that, for example, texts that are judged to be more analytical, to be more formal or logical than other texts also evidence a higher proportion of articles and prepositions and fewer pronouns, auxiliary verbs, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea, that these studies basically establish the validity and reliability of these four summary variables, which are based on the idea that when we express certain sociological stances in language, we do it in a fairly reliable and predictable way by using conventional or grammatical items in a fairly predictable way, right? So it is useful, like I said just now, when the content of your language is not of primary interest, but rather you're interested in the how rather than the what, right? So for the four summary variables, the analytical thinking kind of like measures how formal or logical versus informal or personal, right? So all these are on a scale of 0 to 100. The higher it is, the higher the variable value is, right? So cloud measures how confident versus how tentative your language is. So for instance, when you analyze emails of superiors to subordinates versus vice versa, you will see that the cloud score of superiors to subordinates is usually much higher than vice versa, right? Authenticity is about how honest or open the language is versus how distant or guarded it is, right? And then finally, emotional tone is a measure of how positive or upbeat the language is versus how negative it is, right? So all these are on a scale of 0 to 100, and they are basically based on a linear combination of various linguistic variables. So in this specific study, it is interesting to apply to see how my linguistic expression of all these variables have evolved or changed. So of course, we know that for instance, in identity research, in discourse analysis, for instance, or identity research, some of these variables may be understood in a slightly different way, right? So for example, authenticity, the meaning of authenticity may not always be like the present definition, but for this specific study, we focus on these operational working definitions of these variables. Okay, so when we import the transcripts into the program, we get basically like a data set like this. And just a word of advice, like, Excel is kind of like a very good tool for managing our data. So for instance, this is actually the actual data file that I have. You can see here, these are, each row is like a session segments. L11 is the first hour of lecture 1, and so on and so forth. And so essentially it boils down to each column being a variable and each row being like a unit of observation, right? So we have the transcript information here, what lecture it belongs to, right? You notice that the first 3 sections all belong to lecture 1, and this is used for mixed effects models, which I'll talk about later on. And then each segment, whether the mode is online or face-to-face, the 4 variable scores, and these are the actual transcripts that I also imported into Excel for further analysis, for instance, manual analysis, and also when you want to apply computational linguistic methods like vectorization, word embedding, you can then use this directly and then to regress it upon certain variables. For instance, you want to predict whether language use can, we want to see whether language use can predict the mode that you are in, then you can use some kind of logistic regression or something like that by vectorizing the actual language. Right, so before I introduce the quantitative modeling process, I want to introduce 3 quotes that kind of like describe it in a way, right? So the first one is, okay, let me take the 2 back and show it one by one. So Chris Chatfield, who is a statistician, he has this quote that I find very interesting. He says that students are often given the impression that a quantitative analysis consists of doing a t-test or fitting a regression curve. However, life is rarely as simple as that. So he wrote this quote in 1988 when this book, the first edition of this book was published. So in a sense, I agree with the red line, but I also have something to say about the blue sentence. So nowadays, with the advent of things like programming languages, it is far easier. Life can be not as difficult as it seems, right? So yes, on the one hand, indeed, quantitative modeling is not just about doing tests or looking at p-values. I agree with that completely. But it is about crafting an interesting story from an ecology of variables. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. I'm going to craft an interesting story about my own language use based on these 4 variables and which lecture they belong to, which mode they belong to. However, we are not in 1988 anymore because of the advent of a lot of open source programming languages and things like that. Yes, it is not simple, but also not too hard. Right, so this is the message that I've been trying to push recently in my work and with some other colleagues. For instance, myself and Molly from Fudan University, we have this volume in press to talk about the use of data analytics in cognitive linguistics. Right, so you can see like there's a shift in the research trend. And finally, a quote from one of my favorite quantitative statisticians, right, George Box: "All models are wrong, but some are useful." Right, so we know that all statistical models, including the ones I'm going to talk about today, are wrong because they are just representations, right, abstractions of the real language, of the real discourse. But nevertheless, some of them are useful, especially if they give you some insights into some of the phenomena that would otherwise evade you if you just focus on looking at manual language. So this kind of like is an overview of quantitative modeling. Okay, and then to be more specific, I recommend, or rather, adopted from Chatfield. Generally speaking, people follow this kind of 4-step or maybe 5 steps kind of approach towards quantitative modeling. So the first, which I will also follow in this talk. So the first step is really scrutinizing our data. So our data basically is this, right? So we have kind of like condensed our 2 years worth of classroom language into this Excel data file, right? Both the quantitative and the qualitative data. Okay. We scrutinize it, we understand the descriptive stats, we look at things like central tendency, distribution, variance, and stuff like that, right? We use visualization. So that's another advantage of learning a bit of programming, because you can generate simple visualizations or even complex visualizations that gives you a bird's eye view of the patterns, such as histograms, scatter plots, bar plots, which I will show. And then based on your understanding of this, you formulate a sensible model to test, right? You understand how your variables relate with each other. Right, so in our case, we understand how these 4 variables relate with each other. We understand how they relate with the mode of delivery, and then we formulate certain models and test them. Okay, sorry. Right, so to do so, we also need to draw a lot from our theoretical or contextual or background knowledge to critically ask questions about the descriptive statistics from the first step. So we ask ourselves, what kind of story do I want to tell? So it's not just about looking at p-values, like we said just now. Right, and then the next step is to actually fit and evaluate your models, right? Ensure that the fitted model adequately accounts for systematic variation in the data. So as much variation in data as possible, your model can capture it, and then of course the rest is like residual errors, right? So the unsystematic part, we should try to reduce that part. Okay, and lastly, communication. Communicate the findings, present it in a simple way, present implications, but also be aware of the assumptions of the model and the limitations of your model. So this is kind of like a 4-step approach or process that can be applied as a way of thinking about a situation quantitatively. Okay, so therefore, let's take a look at our descriptive statistics. So this is the overview of the mean variable scores of our 4 variables. So just to remind you, analytic is how logical the language is, or how formal it is, right? Cloud is how powerful it sounds, so to speak, right? Authentic is how open versus how guarded it is, and tone is about how positive or how negative it sounds. So this is all my language. So the brackets are the standard deviations. This is the mean. And we can just compare it with some other benchmarks that have been published about other genres. So for instance, we can see that for both semesters, right, the online semester, which is the recent one, and the face-to-face, which is 2 years ago, they kind of like most closely resemble natural speech, which is not surprising because it is a kind of semi-natural speech. So the degree of analyticity is similar to natural speech. So I guess that is sort of good news, right? And then cloud is surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, it's interestingly similar to novels rather than something like natural speech, right? And then the degree of authenticity, as you can see, for the online course, which is much lower, right, is similar to like a newspaper. So it's like somehow in the online semester, I spoke in a more guarded, in a more impersonal way, so to speak. And then for the face-to-face semester, it was like expressive writing. I seem to be able to be much more fluid and open in front of a real life audience. Okay, and for emotional tone, both semesters are quite close to natural speech. So this is like just like benchmarking, right? Looking at the descriptive values to have a bird's eye view. And then I was talking about visualization. So again, this is kind of like directed towards more like students, right? Because the message here is that when you do quantitative modeling, the first step is always to explore your data using visualizations if possible, right? So this is an example of a pair plot, right? So what it is basically it's just the 4 variables, as you can see. It shows the histograms of each semester. The red is online, the blue is face-to-face. It shows the histograms that gives you an idea of the spread and the mean, and also whether a certain semester is much higher or lower than the other, right? So for instance, in this case, you can see for analytic, both semesters are actually quite close, but the blue semester, face-to-face, is much more spread out because the histogram is much fatter, right? And for a sharper histogram, more values are concentrated around the mean. And for a fatter histogram, it's more spread out. And you notice for all 4 variables, it's the same thing. The face-to-face language is always more erratic and spread out. It is less predictable than online language, okay? And then in this case, you can see the histogram is shifted to the left much more than to the right. So in this case, online values are much lower than face-to-face values. And in this case, it's the reverse. So you see, for authenticity, I'm much less authentic online than face-to-face. But for tone, it's the reverse. So these are histograms, and these are the scatter plots, which look at the correlations between all the variables. Okay, so this pair plot already gives you a bird's eye view of the distribution and the bivariate relationships and how they differ according to the semesters, right? So whether be it for research or personal reflection, this gives us some entry points. There are some salient observations that give us a kind of an entry point. Let us understand, okay, what am I going to likely to want to explore further? In this case, as I mentioned just now, face-to-face is more erratic, right? Higher standard deviation, you can see at one glance. Online is much less authentic, but much more positive, okay? And then some bivariate relationships are reversed. So for instance, very interestingly, if you consider the correlation between cloud and tone, so in other words, if I try to sound more authoritative, do I also try to sound more positive, something like that? And for face-to-face, the correlation is positive, as you can see here. But in online, it's reversed. So that's an interesting entry point for you to explore further. Why is this the case? And reflect upon how you have used language in your own class. Okay, so that's the first visual overview that is useful. So you can also put this in something like your teaching portfolio, maybe in a simplified form. So at one glance, people can understand and appreciate how your language has changed, for example. Right, visual overview 2 is more like probing into how each lecture has an internal pattern, right? So in this case, you can see again, the first row is the online lectures, 1 to 10. Second row is face-to-face. The 4 colors are the 4 variable lines. And then, it's section. This is the first hour, second hour, third hour. So from this, we can already see that there is some clustering going on, or non-independence of scores going on. So what I mean by clustering is that the scores within a lecture is actually closer than scores across lectures. And this is not surprising because within a lecture, I'm likely to be more aware and consistent in terms of my language use within a lecture. And the next week, I'm likely to shift a little bit. So in other words, we can say that each lecture has a unique score profile, especially in face-to-face. You can see here is very erratic. Each lecture has a very erratic profile in terms of how the variable scores evolve. So this kind of observation tells us that we are most likely to need to consider multi-level modeling or mixed effects modeling, which kind of like takes into account how the phenomenon is clustered, so that instead of ignoring this variation, we consider how the clustering actually contributes to the overall variation of the data. Okay, so by fitting a mixed effects model, right, by comparing the overall online versus face-to-face, we find that, all right, we can see here that in face-to-face, my authenticity is much higher, and for online teaching, my emotional tone is much higher, and the other variables are not significantly different. So what we did here was, instead of a typical something like a t-test, something like a within subjects t-test or something like ANOVA, instead of that, we fit a mixed effects model. So the variable scores are the outcomes, right? We have a fixed effect, which is the mode, right? But for the lectures, we treat it as a random effect, right? So because we want to consider how the clustering of scores within each lecture is going to affect the outcome. But we cannot afford to use lecture as its own variable because there's too little data. Because we have 10 lectures, if we use lecture as a predictor variable, then we are going to have, we're going to have 10 groups, because there's only one lecture, there are 10 groups of lectures, whereby each one is just one, right? I hope you get what I mean. So instead of doing that, we allow each lecture to have a random intercept to account for the variability. So this is, I'm not going to elaborate too much into the technical details, but what happens is after we do so, we find that, face-to-face has higher authenticity, online is more positive. ICC is something called the intra-class coefficient. So it's from 0 to 1. It basically tells you how much of your variability is accounted for by the clustering. So in both cases, this is rather high. So this again tells us that a mixed effects model is likely to be more suitable than your traditional linear model. Okay, so this so far it's very abstract, I know. So let's take a look at some actual examples. Okay, so this is what I mean by, after looking at fitting the models, it gives you an entry point into considering some of the more qualitative analysis. So I just have two short extracts today to show you, right? So both from online, this is from lecture 1 and this is from lecture 10, right? So what I observed from the statistical analysis is, like I said, my online lectures are much less authentic, but much more positive. So what does this actually mean? So if we look more into the qualitative data, we can see, for instance, let's look at the first lecture. Okay, so I start by saying, okay, we are very confident as language majors to express ourselves. So this course is basically teaching some basic quantitative analysis for our English majors. So I say something like, okay, this is why you are here, but this course also teaches you, gives you some basic competence. Okay, you're not going to become math experts, blah, 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 blah. So you notice that I paid a lot of attention to make sure that I sound positive. I say something like, you will be able to appreciate and do well, right? I trust that you guys will put in effort and do very well. But at the same time, because it is online, it seems that I also unconsciously perhaps express a greater degree of caution about the systems and processes. So I kind of say something like, you pay extra careful attention, right? I'm a bit more cautious. I can't see you. So this is my personal guarantee that if you pay attention, you will do well. But I can't really see and interact with you guys like last year. So I cannot be sure, but I trust you guys will put in the effort and do very well. Okay. And then in lecture 10, the last lecture of the semester, again, it seems to be the same thing, right? So this is where I kind of like go through the assignment answers and I say, some of you somehow have not seen the comments yet. I'm not sure why. Let me know if you don't know how to access them from the online system. Okay, but please have a look. Okay, you have done well this year. Congratulations, despite COVID. So again, it seems that from the analysis, it tells us that what I have done is that I express greater degree of caution due to COVID, but I kind of balance it with opportune expressions of positivity. So in that sense, I can kind of like construct a kind of positive spin for myself on how I've adopted or adapted well to online TNL by being aware of the limitations, but also paying some extra effort to kind of like encourage the students. So this is the kind of like combination of qualitative with quantitative modeling. Okay. So that was the first model that we saw, the mixed effects model. The second model that I want to mention is cluster analysis. So more specifically, agglomerative hierarchical clustering. So I'm just going to quickly explain what this means. Right. So the objective of cluster analysis is to group objects. In this case, my objects are actually my lecture segments. I'm interested in how this, so now this is like within each semester. I want to look at how within each semester from lectures 1 to 10, whether or not there are patterns such that certain lectures are more similar to one another. Okay, so to group objects based on their properties. So this method is agglomerative, which means it sticks together. And why is it called agglomerative? Because actually we start by assuming that all lecture segments are different, and we apply an algorithm. This is an algorithm that I use. You don't have to know the details, right? Just for your reference. But if you want to see it, go ahead, right? They are progressively merged into bigger clusters until one giant cluster remains. Okay, so this is different from divisive, where I start off with a giant cluster and I split it until I have X clusters, where X equals the number of objects. Okay, and it's hierarchical because it is exploratory. So the number of clusters is not pre-specified because I have no theoretical reason to assume that the lectures will be into a certain number of groups. And this is opposed to non-hierarchical clustering, where the number of clusters are pre-specified. So for instance, I have theoretical reasons to believe that in this semester, I will see 5 groups, for instance. Okay, so 5 groups of lectures which are linguistically similar. And then I apply some kind of algorithm, something like k-means clustering, to test whether or not this hypothesis fits the data. But I'm not interested in that because I have no reason to suppose anything, so it's more exploratory. That's why it's hierarchical. So together it's called agglomerative hierarchical clustering. Okay, so this is called a clustering solution or a dendrogram. So this represents my online during COVID teaching. So you can see on the x-axis is actually all the 30 segments, L1, 3, and so on and so forth. And if they belong to the same color, that means they are linguistically similar enough, right? So what happens is, as you can see, this is the Euclidean distance is one particular way to measure the so-called distance, linguistic distance between different lecture segments. And what we have here is we can see that the online lectures can be characterized into 2 clusters or 2 linguistic styles. So this table is just a translation of this dendrogram, whereby it's more easy to see that this is in chronological sequence from L1 all the way to L10. And the color code shows that, for instance, at the beginning of the semester, there is a lot of switching from one style to the next. And then it kind of stabilizes and style 2 kind of dominates subsequently. So we define each cluster as a kind of language style because each cluster, by definition, one cluster is different from the next. So therefore, if you think of it linguistically, it's like a combination of linguistic styles, like a package of linguistic styles. Okay, so you might ask me, what does the color mean? So what actually does each cluster look like? So we can go deeper into looking at the clusters. So remember, the clusters are defined based on these 4 variable scores. So let me try to compare how the variable scores differ in the yellow lectures and the green lectures, or rather the yellow lecture segments and the green lecture segments, right? So we can see that style 1 has slightly higher cloud and lower everything else, okay? Based on this, couple this observation with the next observation, which is that chronologically speaking, you can see a lot of switches at the beginning of the semester as I try to get used to the mode, right? But then there's a gradual stabilization and style 2 begins to dominate. So what is style 2? Again, go back into this. So what I mean is this outlines an approach for you to very systematically probe deeper and deeper into how exactly your language styles differ as the semester progresses. So here we can see very generally, I took some time to get used to the arrangement, but then subsequently I kind of stabilize and style 2 begins to dominate my language. Okay. But interestingly, we can see in lectures 4 and 9, there's a brief switch, and of course in 6.2 as well, brief switch back to style 1, which is characterized by higher cloud. So I suspect it's because lectures 4 and 9 is before the test that I gave students. So I was trying to kind of like get them ready for a test, and I therefore used a bit more so-called authoritative ways of speaking. But again, is that the case? You can go back to the transcript data and look at it for yourself. Okay, this is the clustering solution for face-to-face language before COVID. So here, straight away, we can see that the difference is that now there are actually 3 styles, 3 clusters instead of 2. So immediately we can see that the language here is slightly more varied, more kind of like more diverse, right? And this looks like a very colorful cake or something. So it's quite, quite all over the place. Okay, so which again, applying the same methods for a deeper look at the clusters. I'm not going to go into deep detail because I'm trying to outline an approach that you can use for yourself, right? So my own language may not be that interesting. This is just outlining the way to do it, right? So again, face-to-face language is is internally more erratic and less uniform. Okay. Style 1 has the highest analytic and authentic. You can see for yourself. Style 2 has the highest cloud. Style 3 has the most positive tone. So figure that out into, put this back into this temporal progression. Then you can figure out quite deeply how your language has changed, right? So again, to describe the overall pattern, we see that there are switches at the start of the semester, just like the online language. So it seems that even in face-to-face, I need some time to kind of like settle down, so to speak. And then style 2 dominates the middle, style 3 dominates the end, right? So this kind of analysis gives us potential insights. It's not always useful because sometimes you find that the clusters may not be very different from one another, but potentially it gives us insights into language styles within a certain condition, in this case, face-to-face or COVID, and also compare differences across different conditions. So we can see for face-to-face language, I was more diverse, but for COVID, I seem to be more guarded and less diverse in the way I talk. Okay, right. So I don't want to take up all the time. I would like more, more time for comments and questions. So that is basically the main part of the kind of modeling I used on the two data sets. So it's like a nice little experiment, right, on whether this thing works or not. And now I'm going to talk about what happens if I were to go a bit further. So you can call this work in progress, whereby I also can explore other time-based models. So at the beginning, I described classroom language as a time-based phenomenon, and I think you can see why, because temporal ordering seems to play a role, right? We start at a semester, and then gradually we take students throughout the end. So one of the models that is potentially usable is time series models. So specifically ARIMA models, whereby we can see how variable scores change, and we model it without any other predictors, looking only at historical data, right? And this kind of models is useful for forecasting, which in our case is not so relevant, right? Forecasting is usually used in things like finance to understand future values based on historical values. But in our case, it provides some kind of basis for deeper theorization because it can help us understand how recent past language use kind of like shapes future use. So this is a basis for theory. For instance, recently I talked about something like discourse momentum, how recent past episodes kind of like shape contemporary or rather present episodes. Okay, and then the second part is survival analysis, which is used basically to model what we call time to event data. Now I've been playing around with this, not so much in this data set, but more in like my primary area, which is metaphors and also psychotherapy language. So my question is basically, if people use metaphors in psychotherapy, how long is it going to survive before it dies out in the conversation? Because in psychotherapy, people tend to elaborate. One of the objectives is to kind of like extend the metaphor, play around with its entailments and inferences, explore its relevance to the client's life. But not all metaphors survive that long. Some of them are killed immediately after it's introduced because people fail to notice it, or they find that, it's not useful. So this kind of model can answer this kind of question. How many conversational turns does it take for a metaphor to die? And we can kind of like calculate probabilities that a certain metaphor used by a certain person can last for a certain number of turns. But we can extend this to this kind of context in the classroom. If you identify a certain phenomenon of interest, you can also model how long does a certain kind of phenomenon last in classroom interaction. But not so much. I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but maybe the first one a little bit more, since we have about 10 more minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go through this. So this is the time series plot. So what I did was I plotted my face-to-face language across time. You remember there are 30 segments, right? Because each lecture is divided into 3. So you can see it looks like a mess, right? It's very erratic. So what am I trying to do here? So I'm trying to actually find out whether there's a pattern underlying this apparent mess. I must emphasize the word apparent because the human naked eye is not always very good at spotting patterns, right? So this is what we call autocorrelation functions. So what it does is basically it kind of like tells us whether or not there is a pattern between neighboring lectures, right? So to cut a long story short, right, in the face-to-face data, there doesn't seem to be very strong autocorrelation. So generally speaking, the variable scores seem to be randomly distributed across time. So this is again consistent with my previous observation about a lot of variance in face-to-face language. But even if we explicitly consider its temporal progression across time, there's also not much time series models to actually play around. Okay, but for the online language, right? You can see, actually, I'm just going to talk about authenticity. So because again, in my previous analysis, we also encountered authenticity as a kind of interesting variable. Remember, we said that in the online database, in the online language, I tend to be much less authentic, but much more positive, right? So in this case, you can see this plot, again, to the naked eye, it seems like a mess, right? What the heck is going on? But if we plot autocorrelations, you see that actually neighboring values, one session apart, 2 sessions apart, are actually significantly autocorrelated, which means we can make use of this autocorrelation to kind of like try to construct a time series model to express the use of, not the use actually, to express the authentic scores across time. So this is the modeling process. The first thing I want to find out is, again, going back to what the quote that I showed you just now, George Box, remember what he said? He said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is a good example of that. This model is wrong, so to speak, because you can see the predictor is actually not very significant. The p-value is 0.065. So again, this predictor, which we call a moving average predictor, right? MA1 predictor is actually not statistic. If you use the alpha value of 0.05, like most people do, it's only marginally significant. So this also explains why this plot doesn't look very nice. But nevertheless, what I tried to do was, the blue line is the observed values. So this blue line is exactly the same as this one. And the orange line is actually the time series model that is constructed based on the blue line. You can see it kind of looks like the blue line, but not really. It's a little bit ugly, and that's, in some intervals, it is very accurate in predicting, right? But in most other places, it's quite off. But the general shape is kind of that, right? So if we express this orange line mathematically, this is the equation. So what this does is actually allows us to kind of like predict at each interval what is likely to be the score of authenticity, right? So because it is MA1, if you give some kind of discursive interpretation, so this is, I must say, this is quite speculative. This is like work in progress, but discursively, this kind of model actually kind of like can be interpreted as this, right? Whereby an unexpectedly high or low display of authenticity in the previous interval tends to be restored in the next interval. So to put it in simple words, if in a certain segment I tend to be very authentic or very not authentic, I tend to regulate myself and balance it in the next segment, right? You can see it in this kind of zigzag shape. It tells us that if you are extremely authentic or not authentic in the first segment, somehow you kind of like regulate yourself back. And this kind of like can be modeled. So when we say it can be modeled, we say that it can actually be formalized, it can be predicted to varying degrees of error. In this case, again, it's not a very nice model, but it kind of tries, it kind of like shows us that there is some potential patterning going on that is quite hard to detect if you just rely on kind of like manual discourse analysis. Okay, right? And just very quickly, survival analysis. This is just data from actually a different project. So this is not my data set, but I just want to show you what it looks like. So again, the whole idea of survival analysis is to kind of like model the probability. In this case, these are metaphors, right? So I kind of model how long a metaphor generally lasts in therapy. So these are actually conversational turns. So you can see the probability of, so for example, the probability of a metaphor surviving past 10 turns is less than 0.2. So most metaphors die within 10 turns in psychotherapy. And if you can split it by who initiates the metaphor, so this is where you do some kind of comparative analysis. If you look at therapist-initiated metaphors versus client-initiated metaphors, you see that actually client-initiated metaphors have a higher probability of surviving longer. And this is not surprising because when clients initiate metaphors, the therapists tend to play with it, pick it up and play with it. But the other way around is not in the job scope of the client. So when a therapist uses a metaphor, the client is less sensitive towards it, and that's why it dies faster. Okay, the hazard curve is just like it's kind of like the converse of survival curve. It tells us at any point of time how likely what is the instantaneous risk of dying. So yeah, something like that. So my point is, this analysis, it can be applied to look at certain classroom phenomena, to look at, for instance, if you were to initiate something, how likely is it that students is going to pick it up and how long does it last into your class? But I didn't quite go into it for this data set. So I just want to show you this as a possible methodology. Okay, looks like I'm doing fine for time. So time to conclude, right? So in my talk today, just a very quick sharing, right? I kind of like want to tell you that COVID-19 Although a lot of us are perturbed, distressed, affected by it, but from a more optimistic point of view, it kind of presents opportunities, right, to research and reflect on classroom language. Okay. So quantitative modeling has traits of flexibility, transparency, and replicability, right? And that is why we kind of encourage its use, right? And important to note that it supports or complements, but cannot replace, right? Cannot replace more introspective or qualitative methods of linguistic and discourse analysis. So in my talk, I tried to show you how we can use both, although the qualitative part is more or less limited because of time. Okay, and it may lead to specific and actionable insights. So what I mean by specific insight is my specific realization that online talk is less authentic but more emotional and more positively emotional.